Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Principal Liner Notes podcast. This is Sean Gaylord here. And no, there is nothing wrong with your screen if you have been following the succession and the sequence of all of the episodes. This is not a repeat episode. This is the third return, which I'm very grateful for, of my friend and colleague and thought partner, Elizabeth Dampf. She has just recently published a book through Roman and Littlefield entitled Dealing with Staff Turnover, Systems That Make Schools More Resilient in Times of Change. And I'm really honored to have endorsed this. And I'm just so pleased that this is out there and grateful, Elizabeth, that you took me up on the standing offer to come back to the podcast.
I'm always happy to be here, Sean. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, we always have the best conversations, and our third time doing this, the pre-conversation, it's like, well, man, we've been talking for almost 30 minutes before we hit record. So that's actually, I think the last time it may have been almost an hour or a little over, and then, well, we should press record. So always grateful for you and grateful to have you back. I know one of the things that you've written about, which has led me to your work, is some of your previous blog posts and references on in the imposter syndrome and leadership and really how that has manifested itself not just within all industries, but you've really kind of focused on imposter syndrome through the lens of school leadership. And I also know that you are writing a second book on that very topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I wrote the blog, it was well over a year ago. I
Mhm.
think I had one idea of imposter syndrome in my mind, and it was perhaps motivated by leaders I saw in my district thinking, "Oh, they know what they're doing and I don't. So clearly everyone can see that I'm the fake here. Or everyone will see it soon." But the interesting thing is, in the year and a half since then, I'm still not sure I know what a leader is supposed to look like because at this particular moment in education, I just feel like we get called on to reinvent ourselves constantly. So the model of leadership that worked a year ago doesn't work this year. The model of leadership that I was trained to do in grad school hasn't worked really since then. And the model of leadership that I'll need next year hasn't been invented yet. And so just the constant reinvention is really triggering so much self-doubt. It can't just be for me either, because I see people, I mean, not just since COVID, but especially in the wake of the pandemic, having to continually reassess, what does leadership look like here? What model of leadership should I use now? For instance, I think I was always trained very much to make a plan and roll a plan out. That doesn't really work right now. These days, it's very much assess the lay of the land and do what is responsive to your people that you're leading. But if I had heard myself say that 10 years ago, I would have said, well, that's terrible. You should never do that. But who knows what's right? It changes from moment to moment, doesn't it?
Why do you think that's changed so much? Because you're absolutely right. I mean, I think about the 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 emblem of school leadership, that or the myth or whatever it was, whatever we want to call it, the model, and felt like I had to wear the three-piece suit. I had to have my shoes polished. I had to walk in every single facet of the building and work 12, 14 hours, and clearly that didn't work. But why do you think there is this kind of constant shift um, in the space when it comes to leadership?
One woman's opinion, I think the people are shifting. And when I say the people, I do mean everyone, students, staff, administrators, everyone is changing. So I guess let's start with students and their needs, because I think that that sort of pushes on teachers, which then pushes on their leaders. I think as teachers face the challenges related to things like student behavior, student social emotional needs, everything from cell phones and student attentiveness, family needs and situations. And we look at the people that we serve at the end of the day, our students, and then we say, well, these are different people from what I'm used to. I need to do something different myself. maybe I also have different needs, and maybe I also am a different type of person than who I was 20 years ago or 10 years ago, even. Um, our teachers, I think, are more willing to draw firm work-life boundaries, which is wonderful. I mean, something when I was a teacher, I always despised that performative virtue of, oh, I was here until 7 last night. Well, I was here until 8 last night, but I think you don't see that anymore. I think you see teachers drawing some firmer lines, and I think demanding a little bit more social respect and a little bit more compassion for the things that they are going through in their own lives. And they're not just a servant to the school district anymore. And I think that all of that domino effects maybe right on over to leaders. So I've seen more administrators start to say, well, look, I'm going to end my day at 4:15. That is, I'm going to close my computer. I
Mm,
will not be answering emails unless it is an emergency call from the police department or the superintendent. I won't be on my phone constantly throughout the day. Um, my mental health is a priority. I'm not going to sacrifice my emotional well-being to the job. At the end of the day, it's just a job. And I think that when the people make that seismic of a change, you have to lead them differently. If I'm leading a staff that is trying to truly have a work-life balance, I
mhm,
differently than if I have 30 people who are saying, I can't wait to get here at 4 a.m. tomorrow to do something. Both are great. And I think it should be a teacher's choice which of those they would like to do. Both are valid. Both, you can be a great teacher with either of those.
mhm.
But if I know that the tides are shifting in one direction or the other, I just lead differently. I don't know what I mean, what's your perspective, Sean? Like it could be anything. I could be totally off base.
No, no, I think you're definitely onto something. I think a lot of it, has to do with the fact that, I think definitely the people shifting, and changes, that are prompted by needs and wants and those things. And then I would also say, just thinking about this kind of shift is, um, education itself as an industry has shifted, and the way that, when I was a student, um and school growing up in the 70s and 80s is definitely different today as it is with you. Um and I think it's hard for, and I also think too, because there's a level of subjectivity in adopting one's leadership core or persona, and some of that too is driven by your values. Values vary. um and then what you have here is maybe not a one size fits all thing, but more of what I was talking about with you earlier about this notion of really tuning into the agility. um I also think too, sometimes when with all of those shifts and all of those changes, it does it can be a triggering thing for leaders. As we've talked about before several times about imposter syndrome, and I'm, trying to think about what is at the root cause of that. Is it the changing landscape? Is it the changing models of leadership? And then when we don't aspire to or hit that level of leadership, then does that imposter syndrome ensue? I don't know. What?
Yeah, I was just thinking it might also be that there are so many situations for which there simply is no preparation, or at least not any
Yeah.
preparation other than having been in that situation before, and then you're prepared to handle it again. So, um, thinking, for instance, of situations that really spark people's doubt, the first time you find yourself in front of an angry mob, eh, there's no grad school textbook on that topic, but
Yeah.
I don't know a single administrator or leader of any kind, really, who hasn't at some point been standing in front of a crowd of angry people trying to sell them on something. Um, that raises your doubts right through the roof because you think to yourself, oh, I had a wonderful plan or policy that I was going to talk to these people about, and now they're all really angry. What did I do wrong? Am I terrible? Do they hate me? Did I make a mistake along the way somewhere, right? Am I just an awful salesperson? Did I not prepare enough? So it really sparks a lot of doubts, and yet there's no preparation for that. And I wish that there were a grad seminar that you could take on angry mob management, but
Yes.
there isn't, right? Or the first time, and for a lot of us, COVID was the epitome of this, but it happens even without a global pandemic. The first time you're handed some task that no one else wanted to do, and that you don't have any preparation for, and that no one trains you how to do, but all of a sudden you are the family resource coordinator now. And you're like, but I'm actually an assistant principal. Nope, you got to do family resource coordination. And you're just or congratulations, you are going to set up our online tutoring system. And you're sitting there thinking, what? That's not in my job description, but it's an important project. Someone has to do it, right? And so you encounter these scenarios that you just can't prepare for, and they make you question whether you're in the right field.
Yeah. And you hit a very valid point about what they don't prepare you for in grad school. Wouldn't it be great if there was dealing with an angry mob, seminar? I recently wrote about, they don't teach you how to deal with loneliness in school leadership. Wouldn't it be great if there was a class that helped you with combating that isolating, fatigue, really, that in many ways is a catalyst for imposter syndrome, right? Leaders are lonely. Leaders are bereft. If you're a principal in a schoolhouse, you're the only principal in that building. Hopefully you've got a leadership team and some assistant principals and other thought partners around it to help you with that. But that's not always the case for many principals.
Yeah, really true. And I think that that loneliness is something that surprises an awful lot of people. And maybe they don't consider what the loneliness does to them as a person. So I think you mentioned also just what your job does to your home life or to who you are, and like your work persona versus your home persona. And if those two people are at complete opposite ends of a spectrum, maybe there's a little bit too much of a facade being put on when you go to work. And then you really do feel like an imposter because you're kind of putting on a mask every time you walk into your office or into your school. And the loneliness, if you're not normally a person who is, I don't know, isolated or prefers being on their own, but then suddenly you feel really lonely at work, that almost causes a little bit of a cognitive dissonance. And I think that's something that shocks a lot of first time leaders, is how all of a sudden I was a happy teacher who used to go out to happy hour on Fridays with all of my teacher buddies, and we would hang out together. And, I was always doing something, always someone saying hello. We had a text chain and everything. And now here I am in my office alone,
Yeah.
no text chain, no group of buddies, no carpooling. That's sad.
It is. I can attest to that. I remember very, very quickly those first few years where I lost a lot of friendships. Not just based upon the role, because people look at you differently or see you as the man or the woman or, um, just tough. It is tough. Um, and I know that there are different organizations that are looking at the leadership pipeline and looking at ways to build in supports for leaders, and certain districts have, dedicated principal coaches, or there are different companies and organizations that are out there that provide sustained coaching for school leaders. So I mean there are some solutions out there, um, but not always readily available. In your work and research on imposter syndrome, any kind of, and we've been kind of wrestling with this topic for almost a year and a half now, you and I. Any new revelations, any new insights or new trends that you've come across since I'm not going to say infamous, but since the groundbreaking blog post from ASCD that you wrote, that got a lot of attention and a lot of and rightly so, a lot of dialogue and conversation.
Well, thank you for not asking if I know how to solve it, because I have been asked that question and I don't. Um, I think that the tough thing about imposter syndrome is that there is no definitive program that you can go through, no mentor program, coaching program, no graduate school program, no training regimen, no leadership, executive counseling or whatever that will put a seal on you and say, "All right, Sean, you're good enough now. You're done learning. I certify you as being completely done with all of your training, and you now are good enough, and you can have confidence in yourself to go off into the workforce knowing that you are perfectly adequate to do everything that we are asking you to do." It doesn't end. And even a wonderful mentor, which if you're lucky enough to have that, that's great, but that still isn't enough to completely extinguish imposter syndrome. And so I think there is a certain amount of trying to convert it into learning opportunities, which I know sounds like a glib answer because, of course, every time you screw something up, you should be thinking, how can I turn this into a learning opportunity? But even that self doubt in some ways means that you have the open door for reflective practice. I would be much more skeptical of a leader who walked in with no doubt than a leader who walked in with tons of doubts. So the leader who doesn't have any doubt or who doesn't seem to have any fear or who doesn't wonder whether doing the right thing probably is screwing up a lot and not realizing it, or probably isn't willing to look at his mistakes, or probably doesn't have a lot of reflective capacity to trigger growth. But the person who is constantly wondering, well, how did I handle that? I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm prepared for this, is at least going to prepare and is going to reflect on whether they handled that right and is going to seek feedback. So it's an uncomfortable spot to be in. It really is. No one likes doubting themselves or being afraid that they're a total poser. But on the other hand, it's better to have that, I think, little seed of wondering if you're doing a good job than to walk in completely blithe and assuming that you're perfect.
Yeah. I think anything that requires a paradigm shift and anything that requires a systemic change requires uh, a pretty high level of radicalism. And so I'm not espousing anarchy here in this kind of question. But as I think about what you're saying, and I think about, like, for example, some of the work like that's coming out of Arizona State University, with trying to combat the teacher retention crisis, and how they're looking at restructuring workforce models in the schoolhouse. So moving away from singular teaching to maybe something much more modular, something much more collaborative, where you've got co-teaching, and they've got a lot of research to show by kind of this workforce redesign, or what they call the next education workforce, that it's going to create better work-life balance, and decrease teacher attrition and all that kind of stuff. So what are your thoughts about that with leadership? What kind of radical ideas or shifts do you think need to be made to combat imposter syndrome, to combat loneliness, to combat leadership fatigue, and to perhaps reinvigorate leaders who are struggling, or maybe it's not as broad and dramatic as a radical change.
No, I'd love to see a radical change. I mean, to me, the thing that has pretty obviously stopped making sense in education is the way that schools are organized with a principal, maybe some assistant principals, and then teachers. That doesn't seem to work for anyone. Firstly, it foments so much teacher administrator animosity. And I just think that the system is to blame for a lot of the way that teachers and administrators talk about and treat each other. A term that I hate, but sometimes catch myself using is admin. And when teachers refer to admin as being a unilateral entity, right? So admin walked in and you're like, who? Mr.
Yeah.
Smith? And then I think administrators are very happy to sometimes talk about teachers as a blanket entity and perhaps not with the level of respect that they deserve. because they had a negative interaction with one teacher one time.
Mhm.
And so that system isn't super effective. And I also think it leads to unrealistically high expectations on the one leader of the school. And that person then is set up for failure because they can't be everything to everyone. They can't do everything central office wants, and the board and the union and their staff and parents and students. And they're in the middle trying to manage all of these demands. Why does it have to be that way? That's my question. I mean, and it's partially rhetorical, but partially not. We assume that this is the only way to organize schools because we've been organizing schools with a principal and with teachers as subordinates for 100 years. So we just assume that this is the only viable method. And I think we've made some strides in the last 10 years when you see teacher leadership positions starting to emerge. But I still do think that when we have this hard line, usually delineated by a graduate degree and a separate type of license between administrators and teachers, that's where the trouble is coming from. And I think that's where you get the imposter syndrome,
Mhm.
the doubt, the over stressing, and like the serious health consequences for leaders. And that's where I think you see the resentment and the anger and the burnout and the I can't meet your unrealistically high expectations from teachers who feel like they're being set up for failure too. So I think that's, and I do not have like a perfect system for a school. I just think that we need something radically different from what we have.
Well, Elizabeth, maybe that's the third book, you
Maybe
know, and just in terms of disrupting, and I'm not even half serious. I'm serious about this. Like, I really think, just as there is this work to restructure, if you're going to restructure teaching, right? And if you're going to and move away from one room, one teacher, that kind of traditional sense, you also you've got to make sure that you're also disrupting in a positive way the existing structure or hierarchy. And even though there has been this great onset of teacher leaders, there's still a line. There's still a line between admin and teachers. And sometimes that line is very evident. Sometimes that line, there's about two or three lines in there. I mean, there's all kinds of issues there. That's where the disruption has to take place. I think if we're gonna do that, you got to disrupt the whole hierarchy, because who's to say that principal, assistant principal, maybe instructional facilitator, department, this kind of
pyramid.
man, exactly, this pyramid, we've been doing it for 100 years. And
Yeah, and it comes from, I think, just standard American industrialism and capitalism of assuming that there has to be a hierarchy and assuming that if there isn't a single throat to choke, then the school will fall apart because I need to know who to go to, who to make the authoritarian decisions, and who to blame. But come on. And I honestly think a moment of optimism here. I truly do think that teachers are ready for it. I think that what we see from teachers across the country in terms of what they're asking for their voices to be heard and for some serious changes to be made in education that they themselves don't feel empowered currently to make, probably because they aren't empowered to make.
Mhm.
I think they're ready to take that next step. And I think that if you did have some sort of a school, and I'm sure there's some charter school out there that is doing this right now, but if you did have a school that structured its leadership differently in ways that gave small groups of teachers or whatever more specific power over aspects of the school, whether that's, this is the team that makes the behavioral decisions, and this is the team that makes academic decisions, and we have teachers leading evaluations, and we have teachers in the front seat really. And then I don't know if that is something that necessitates an administrator, or if you just figure out a different system of distributing power to where teachers have a say and they don't need to clamor to make their voices heard
Right.
because they're running the school. So they're not going cap in hand to someone saying, I have a great idea, please listen to me, or I need something, I beg you, give it to me. They already have the authority that they need to make it happen.
Yeah, and some of that too, this kind of structure hierarchy that we're playing with, you know, it should also reflect the current workplace. And not to say that every workplace has this kind of design thinking um structure. But there are several, successful corporate entities that, that have this kind of different kind of distribution of leadership and power and authority and decision making, where it's much more unified. And if schools, if we're going to be college and career ready and future ready, and I think those are all good things to value and to espouse, the schoolhouse has to kind of look like that, or be agile enough to kind of bend that way in service, really, of kids who are going to be in those environments and be in those situations. I'm touching on portrait of a graduate kind of work. What we used to call back in the day 21st century skills, the World Economic Forum, the top 10 job skills, each year. It's really got to look like that. And I think it requires some humility, some openness, and again, agility on school boards, districts, leaders, and organizations to, all right, let's really get into this and do this.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the workplace, the 21st century workplace, because that's a great point, considering that teachers are trying to prepare students for these dynamic workplaces where they work in teams, they collaboratively problem solve, they're creative, they listen to each other's voices and uplift each other's voices. They believe that their own matters and will be heard. And they're, able to shift around into different jobs because predictions are that our students are going to be experiencing many more career changes than we do. But our teachers are preparing students for this workplace that they themselves don't work in, right? So when schools are hierarchical and they are so top down, and teachers are treated as just this one blanket entity, but then we expect teachers to create a dynamic classroom that has different voices and different problem solving techniques and, design thinking and like maybe a genius hour, but teachers are treated like automata. How can they do that?
Right, that's right. No, and I think one thing that I espouse, because you're absolutely right, because teachers have to have not only that exposure within the schoolhouse and to work in, but that's a tough shift too for teachers. Again, we just mentioned this kind of educational paradigm has been going on for 100 plus years, and there are certain uh, prep programs that perpetuate that. Um, I've done this a couple of times in different principal gigs where um, we've done teacher field trips to corporate places and you know form a partnership and a dialogue in terms of, man, they're not sitting in rows, or nobody's look, there's productive noise, there's all these things, but you've got to do kind of a very targeted, holistic and organic exposure for teachers to do that. But I do see that as a powerful learning opportunity, and maybe something that would really be fun to develop and harness with. And I know there are corporate entities that would love to do this.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's an investment in their future too, right? If they are able to get the type of graduate really that's going to thrive in their workplace, why wouldn't they want to help make that type of classroom a reality? Yeah, and I know there's all kinds of good workplace partnerships out there. I mean, my district does it. I know plenty in the area are trying to make it happen. And I also think that sometimes, like if I were a teacher, I would feel a little bit fettered by what was logistically feasible when I have, like at a high school, for instance, 9 periods a day, 45 minutes per
Mhm.
period, finite resources. And I myself am working in such a rigid system that I feel like, oh, to train my students for the workplace, I also must be rigid. I mean, it's kind of sad. I think that, and I was guilty of this too as a teacher, but I think that sometimes when we think about preparing students for the real world, unfortunately, it's so punitive. It's they must learn to meet deadlines because no one ever misses a deadline in their workplace.
Yeah, guilty.
I know. I did it too. I did it too. And I certainly miss deadlines sometimes in my own job, but we have this very, very punitive attitude towards workplace preparation. Oh, they need to learn. And then we insert a variety of compliance and obedience related skills instead of creative and collaborative skills. And what does that say about us and how we perceive work? I mean, there might be a subliminal aspect here where the way that we're treated really filters into the way that we treat students.
Amen. Amen to that. For those that may not be familiar with dealing with staff turnover, for those that are just tuning into the podcast for the first time, to share with us a little bit about your great new book.
Well, let's see. So it rests on the premise that turnover will happen. So if I were an emperor, I would be able to make a lot of systemic changes that maybe could stop teacher turnover or at least mitigate it for the foreseeable future. But because none of us here or listening has that type of positional authority where we can just wave a wand and create better pipelines with universities or automatically double every teacher's salary or increase benefits and pensions, none of us can do these things that would necessarily staunch the flow of teachers out of the profession as much as we might like. Because of that, I am a realist. And I think that what we need to do is look turnover in the face and say, well, it's going to happen. I'm not a pessimist, but I am also not going to be crushed by it. And so if I control what I can control, which is my district and the way that we induct new teachers into our schools where I work, if we take that premise, then I actually do think that it can be a pretty heartening read because you can help the way that you induct teachers. And I know teacher induction is not everyone's favorite topic. It is one of mine, but it's not everyone's favorite topic. But if you look at it as something, as an opportunity to address turnover rather than like solve it or try and ignore it, yeah, you can do a lot of great things. So the thesis of the book really comes down to focus your efforts on repeatable, teachable, clean, clear systems. So I keep thinking back to my own induction and probably the induction that a lot of your listeners had, which is welcome to the district. Here is a classroom key. Let us know if you need anything. And that was not a very effective induction. And I spent my first year just scrambling around trying to figure out basic things like how the district worked, where the curriculum was, what the discipline policies were, what paperwork I needed to fill out when. And I didn't even dare do anything too extreme like take my kids on a field trip because I didn't know the system for it. And so to me, in the information age, when all of the information in the known universe can be summoned using this device right here, it's just silly that we make teachers scramble around for these things. And to any school administrator or leader listening, I mean, you and I know that it's because of administrative turnover, right? Like a new leader comes into the district and suddenly there's a whole new HR process or business process and tech process, and all of the things change all of the time. But if there isn't a system for managing all of that and for making it clean and clear to your staff, not just your incoming teachers, but even your incoming administrators, you're going to suffer. And then that is where teachers who are coming in say, this is a mess. I can't even plan a lesson because I'm so busy figuring out how to use the copier, or I'm so busy trying to figure out where to put my sub plans, or all of these things that we perceive as being little and trivial and beneath our notice. And yet, to a teacher in the classroom, they're not little, they're not trivial, they're massive. They take up so much of teachers' time, but so little administrative time. So I think if we are going to address the turnover that will happen, we have to look at the way that we use systems as an induction tool.
And beautifully said. And one of the things too that probably my biggest takeaway from the book, and you shared it, it's inevitable. It's going to happen. Things happen for a host of reasons. It's how we respond to that, and you provide a lot of just great solutions and ideas for that because it's staff turnover. It's inevitable. There's external forces that we cannot control. There's some that we can. There's some internal forces that we can and cannot control. But it's just a question of, and to me, it's just kind of a recurring thread throughout the book is how we respond to it. It's like, okay, it happens, but how do we respond to it? It's not going away. It's just like with imposter syndrome. It's unfortunate. It's there, but there's no panacea for it. I believe it's how we respond to it and how we take care of ourselves and each other.
Shoot, I mean, I remember my it was my first meeting with my mentor in my first year teaching. And she looked at me and she asked, and she was a wonderful mentor, but she looked at me and she asked, "How are you doing?" And I made eye contact with her for about 30 seconds in silence. And then I burst into tears
Mm.
and I just cried the whole meeting. That was there, nothing else happened other than me crying, but it was because I was so overwhelmed. And that is a phrase that every first year teacher uses,
Yep.
but we perceive it as inevitable. And we assume that, oh, you get a mentor, it will get better. Get a coach, just be here for 5 years, it will get better. But what we're actually saying is we are unwilling to unwrap the things that are making teaching overwhelming, particularly in your first year. And what we're actually saying is some of the little things that are making your job frustrating, like I can't connect to the printer, like I have absolutely no idea how to enter a sick day, like I don't really have a schedule that allows me to use the bathroom. Like the little things that are making this teacher's job miserable, confusing, that make them completely lost in a sea of information, that make them feel like they were set up for failure. It's actually for the first year teacher, they come in with so many hopes and dreams and they're all excited and wide eyed. And 2 months later, they're crying. Why? It's because it's not even because of any of the big systemic issues. They come up with as much optimism as they possibly can, as they will ever have in their career. And we completely empty that tank in like 8 weeks. And it is largely the result of our schools being allowed to be nebulous, confusing, not nearly as supportive as we think. And if we try and solve this issue by, I don't know, just building culture, it's so fun to work here, but I don't have any published systems anywhere. So you figure out how to enter grades and you figure out how to enroll for direct deposit and you figure out how to enter subplans and you figure out the LMS all on your own. Then we're just ignoring the daily fabric of teachers' lives.
Yeah. It's almost where again, if we're re in this kind of restructuring of hierarchy and leadership, you need a dedicated person for that, because sometimes that does fall, either on the principal or assistant principal, or it becomes another duty as assigned for curriculum coordinator or what have you, and it becomes here's the key, here's the password. Don't use the second copier on the second floor. Later, call me, call me if you need something, So it yeah, that's so true on a lot of different levels. I would also say, Elizabeth, that it an Empress Elizabeth is probably not a bad regime to live under. I'm just saying. I mean, I wouldn't mind it. I think it would be a very sensible, compassionate, and insightful world to be in. I'm just saying.
I'll keep my eye out for any crowns and scepters just in case.
There you go. The crown, the scepter, the cape,
The whole
the
shebang.
throne, the dragon that you can fly. I'm doing this. I'm creating this whole Game of Thrones.
It's all coming together. All
It's all
right.
coming together, but I wouldn't mind you know, Empress Elizabeth world. It's a good world to be in. So if folks are interested in picking up a copy of Dealing with Staff Turnover, what's the best venue or your preferred venue for them to pick up the book?
Well, you can buy it from the publisher, Roman and Littlefield. So it's available there. Or if it is easier for you to just go to Amazon.com, it is also on Amazon.
I can attest to that because I did order it from Amazon.com. Again, Elizabeth Dampf, Dealing with Staff Turnover, Systems that Make Schools More Resilient in Times of Change. And it is a worthwhile read. It's also, I think, would be a great book study kind of book as well for the summer to getting together with administrators and maybe some teacher leaders, and would be a great book to read. And then we've got the second book. And when is that second book coming out? Next year, year after next, or?
Probably early 2025. So it goes into production at the end of this summer. And that one does focus on imposter syndrome. So it will be called When Leaders Feel Like Liars, Self-Doubt, and How to Deal with It.
I really like that title, Elizabeth.
Thank you. It went through a few iterations, but I find it rhetorically beautiful. So I'm very pleased that that's the direction we're going.
I'm excited for that book as well, and that is going to be coming out through ASCD. You can always, if you go to ascd.org, be sure to look up Elizabeth's contributions to their blog. Just spot on, and she's often featured, and rightly so. Elizabeth, big plans for the summer. Do we have a marathon on the horizon? Do we have a road trip? What do we got? A 5K, a 10K? What do you got?
Well, this summer I might be building up my running skills. So, I turn 40 next summer, and I think that a good health milestone for my 40th would be to run another marathon. So, but it's been a minute since my first one, so I got to start training. So, good idea. Otherwise, no, I'll just be around working. Summer's really busy in the world of professional learning. So, speaking of induction, I am preparing for the induction of our staff.
Oh, wonderful. Any conference presentations anytime soon?
Possibly at the Joint Annual Conference in Illinois. Well, it's in Chicago in November, so I anticipate doing a little bit of a roundtable session there.
Nice. Well, all the good things and best of luck on the marathon milestone. That's going to be amazing. And more, I'm not a long distance runner. I'm a Planet Fitness, middle-aged dad workout kind of person. So I have great respect for big goals, workout goals. So that marathon, that's going to be amazing. So uh,
Thank you.
good luck with that, friends. And Elizabeth, thank you for being on the podcast for the third time. This is great. I love just we kind of pick up right where we left off and go into some other territory. And I'm always enriched and inspired and grateful for your words and ideas.
Well, thank you so much. I always love being on this podcast.
Awesome. That's an honor. Well, friends, this concludes episode 181, I think, of the Principal Liner Notes podcast with season 7. This is Sean Gaylord. Very grateful to have Elizabeth Dampf back on again. And as I often sign off, don't forget to share with the world your dreams, your ideas, your insights, because the world needs them and you help make the world a better place. And then also, P.S., be sure to take care of yourself in every sense of that plea, whatever it may be. Turning off work at the appropriate time, taking time for you and your family, and creating a marathon goal, or reading a book, or just sitting and being. That's so important for our profession to just kind of de pressurize what we do. So please hold me to that. I'm going to hold everybody who's listening to that. And again, there's always a flip side, and I hope to catch you there. Thanks again for tuning in.